Recognizing the member for Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Need things a little closer to the eyes these days. Mr. Speaker, I've lived most of my life in the interior of our great province, and most of the time within the Prince George Timber Supply Area, the largest timber supply area in the province. In roughly a year and a half, I'll be 70. For most of the last 50 years, I've trapped, hunted, fished, camped, and hiked throughout the interior of the province. And over these 50 years, I've witnessed the slow and gradual transformation of our natural forests into what industry terms working forests, or monoconifer plantations. I've witnessed the cumulative effects of clear-cutting and the impacts on the disappearance of wildlife populations. I've looked at the proposed changes Bill 23 outlines, and I see this as tinkering with forest policy that is outdated and that no longer meets the needs of British Columbians. We are quite simply out of harvestable trees unless we don't care about habitat for wildlife, salmon, and genuine biodiversity management. Biodiversity management has been an interest of mine for decades, but my passion was ignited after Christy Clark appointed me Parliamentary Secretary for Forests and Lands in 2014 to examine wildlife habitat in British Columbia. I was shocked to see the extent of habitat degradation across the province. For the past 5 years, I've been researching how we got to this point. Where did it start? I began by reading every Royal Commission report on forestry, commencing with the first Royal Commission in 1910. I've read many of the supporting documents considered by the commissioners. I've reviewed numerous scientific papers on forestry, ecology, hydrology, and wildlife management. I've spoken to ecologists, registered professional foresters, wildlife biologists, hydrologists, and industry representatives. I've also taken advantage of a tool accessible to everyone in this House and around the world, Google Earth Engine Time-Lapse. It's a series of land satellite images of British Columbia starting in 1984 through to 2020. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I put more than 10,000 kilometers on my pickup in recent years, traveling into the far reaches of the 3 largest timber supply areas in the province, trying to find the millions of cubic meters of trees supposedly available for harvest. The question motivating my research was, what gave successive governments the right to transform our primary forests into monoconifer stands? I can sum up my research very succinctly. The slow and often obfuscated transformation to working forests was initiated by adopting an incomplete strategy back in 1945, which subsequently morphed into an ideology taught in our colleges and university forestry programs. So let me explain. British Columbia was entrusted with the stewardship of our forests when Canada vested ownership to BC of all forested lands when we entered Confederation. With few exceptions, up to around 1900, all successive governments deliberately retained Crown ownership by issuing licenses and leases over Crown lands to authorize timber extraction. As British Columbia entered the 20th century, logging activity increased exponentially. Around 1904, licenses issued to harvest timber rose at an alarming rate, from 1,500 to over 15,000, resulting in government appointing the first Royal Commission into forest policy. The Fulton Report, 1910, resulted in the first Forest Act in 1912, the beginning of the Provincial Forest Service, and a focus on forest management and protection. In 1943, the second Royal Commission on Forestry commenced, resulting in the Sloan Report, the Forest Resources of British Columbia, 1945. The impetus for this commission was the irregular increase of timber production on private land that had been granted in aid of railway construction on Vancouver Island and a myriad of leases and licenses issued prior to 1907 on the South Coast. Timber harvesting was largely unplanned, leading to industry concerns for future continuity. A major concern for industry at the time was that the licensing and lease arrangements were inadequate in providing a dependable source of logs needed to secure investment. For the first half of the 20th century, logging and forestry activities were primarily confined to Vancouver Island and the South Coast, with limited logging taking place along transportation corridors into the interior. The takeaway from this commission was the origin of the sustainable yield policy. Justice Sloan states at page 127 in his report that a sustained yield policy has as one objective the maintenance of forest cover and growth, thus ensuring a perpetual supply of raw materials for forest industries with consequent stability of industrial communities and assurance of permanent payrolls. A no less important objective is the perpetuation of the forest cover to assure the continuance of many direct and indirect benefits which flow therefrom, in addition to the mere growing of wood. In my view, however, he goes on to say, none of these factors is a necessary or essential ingredient of the definitions to be applied to the term sustainable yield. I want to highlight this, that in defining sustainable yield, the Commission determined the other values on the land were inconsequential to growing and harvesting trees, thus my earlier reference to an incomplete strategy. Until the 1960s, forest companies were focused on intermediate utilization, only taking trees considered suitable for making lumber. It was often referred to as select logging, and any tree smaller than a 12-inch diameter at breast height was left standing. The length of time determined to grow or to regrow forests after logging during the first half of the 20th century was 120 years in the interior and 80 years on Vancouver Island and the South Coast. With the expansion of the pulp industry in the mid-60s, forest companies were required to adopt the close utilization standard to log all the trees on the block, including for the first time pine and hemlock, which up until then were regarded more as weed trees. Trees unsuitable for saw logs were chipped and sent to the 9 pulp mills that appeared during this period. As a result of the change to close utilization, existing volume-based licenses increased by 30% in the interior and doubled on the coast and Vancouver Island. It wasn't until the Royal Commission on Forestry in 1975 before values other than trees were mentioned in any meaningful way. Commissioner Pierce wrote on page 5 of that report, in short, while forest managers have by no means completed the task begun 3 decades ago of designing methods of managing the province's forests for continuous timber yields, the most pressing challenge today is to develop effective means of reconciling industrial forestry with other forest uses and social objectives to realize the full range of potential values. What followed over the next 20 years was a series of legislative and policy changes that can best be described as voluntary guidelines to support multiple forest use practices. The public became more and more disenchanted with the impacts to the environment, and the war in the woods escalated. Attempts were made to mesh land use planning with the annual allowable cut determination, but the process became bogged down and very few determinations were made. The first timber supply review in BC took place in 1992, well over 100 years after timber harvesting began in the province. Until this took place, protected areas, biodiversity, riparian areas, and wildlife habitats were never considered in determining how much forest was harvested until well into the late 1990s. By this time, approximately 17 million hectares of forest had been harvested, with little or no consideration to wildlife, riparian areas, or any other values on the land. As we entered the 1990s, increased environmental concerns over logging practices resulted in the implementation of strict legislation under the Forest Practices Code. While the focus was still on the incomplete strategy of sustainable yield, it now became known as sustainable forest management. The Forest Practices Code was described as the epitome of command and control legislation by some critics and was widely criticized for being overly prescriptive, stifling to innovation, and exacting high transactional costs on industry. It was a relatively short-lived legislation, being replaced by the Forest and Range Practices Act, or FERPA, in 2004. Continuing with the Sustainable Forest Management Policy Direction from 1990 until 2015, another 6 million hectares of clear-cut logging took place, bringing the total hectares logged in British Columbia over the past 100 years to approximately 20 million hectares. Total does not include hectares logged under tree farm licenses, woodlot licenses, community forests, or private woodlots. It also does not factor into the 4 million hectares disturbed by forest fires since 1980, or any of the 700,000 kilometers of resource road right-of-way constructed across the province, or the thousands of hectares consumed by several large hydro reservoirs developed throughout the 20th century, or railway right-of-ways, or a number of other right-of-ways that we have across the province. The timber supply reviews that commenced in the late 1990s determined the timber harvesting land base in BC to be 22 million hectares. Excluding any of the timber harvest land base in remote locations in the northeast and northwest parts of the province, one can reasonably conclude that most of the timber harvest land base in the rest of the province has been harvested at least once. I encourage anyone interested to utilize Google Earth Engine time-lapse to see the extent of clear-cut logging in British Columbia from 1984 until 2020, simply by typing a BC location into the query box in the top left corner of the Google Earth Engine time-lapse website. A significant factor overlooked for well over a century was the hydrological changes resulting from forest cover removal. The interception of rain and snow, the evaporation rates and absorption rates of mature timber were never taken into consideration. Hundreds of thousands of liters of water absorbed by a mature forest on a daily basis. In 1992, British Columbia adopted a calculation referred to as the Equivalent Clear-Cut Area, or ECA, to determine the hydrological impacts of clear-cut logging practices, and they issued a directive, the BC Forest and Lands Extension Note 118, dated January 27, 2017, that stated, and it references the BC Minister of Forests a minute back in 1992, that set ECA thresholds of 20% in community watersheds, 25% in fisheries-sensitive watersheds, and 30% in all other watersheds. This directive indicates that the equivalent clear-cut area of a watershed cannot exceed these amounts without jeopardizing the hydrological integrity of the land base. Mr. Speaker, the Chilako River is just over 100 kilometers long. The watershed, much of it in my riding, has an ECA that was determined in 2011 that exceeded 80%. Harvesting still continued. Chinook salmon counts in that river, as an example, Mr. Speaker, dropped from being in the thousands to single-digit numbers in recent years. Spring freshets have contributed to millions of dollars of damage to property. The Anzac River, another watershed in my riding, is a fishery-sensitive watershed where active logging is continuing, while ECA levels have far exceeded 25%. There are numerous watersheds across the province where ECA values have exceeded 50% and greater, leading to rapid snow melting and downstream flooding. The lack of forest cover has also decreased transpiration values and increased temperatures on the land, accompanied by the inability of the land, in many cases, to retain moisture. Science indicates that it takes a minimum of 85 years after planting for a forest canopy to start providing a similar level of protection from sun radiation, increased transpiration values, and moisture retention on the ground. Although some reforestation began in the 1930s, British Columbia relied mostly upon natural regeneration until the rapid rise in harvest in the 1950s and 60s. By the 1970s, despite ongoing replanting efforts, significant portions of the province were designated as not sufficiently restocked. Federal and provincial programs initiated an aggressive replanting program, planting millions of trees. Lodgepole pine was a species of choice to plant because it was a faster growing tree, reaching a harvestable size only after 60 years. To enhance growth and yield, the province increased the density of new forests by planting 1,000 to 2,500 trees per hectare, far greater than the average mature forest of between 100 and 300 trees per hectare. With the primary focus on growth and yield, major changes to biodiversity have taken place at the landscape level. The following paragraph is quoted from a compendium of environmental and resource information on the Royal BC Museum website. It says, "It's important to recognize that terms such as reforestation and forest renewal do not equate to the restoration of a natural forest with all of their structural and biological attributes. Replanting selected species and harvesting at rotations of 60 years for lodgepole pine and 80 years for other coniferous forests cannot allow the renewal of habitats required by old-growth dependent species, nor is there enough time for more slowly dispersing species, such as some plants, fungi, and insects, to recolonize a harvested area. Once timber has been harvested by clear-cutting, the land replanted and harvested again in currently planned rotations, the natural forest and some of its non-timber values are lost forever. For this reason, modern industrial forestry cannot be considered sustainable in the sense of maintaining all the options for future generations, even though timber harvesting per se is sustainable." Commencing in the late 1990s, the most recent mountain pine beetle infestation affected over 18 million hectares, an area 5 times the size of Vancouver Island, and killed over 50% of the volume of harvestable lodgepole pine in the province. Although the pine beetles were initially attracted to mature growth, once these trees were killed, they attacked younger stands, killing thousands of hectares of immature stands planted in the 70s and 80s. The central interior areas of the province saw significant increases in the harvest levels to process the dead pine before it deteriorated. Over the past century, there were also many incidents of spruce beetle outbreaks. One of the most significant in the 1970s occurred in the Bowen River area near Prince George, affecting over 175,000 hectares. It's over 2/3 the size of Metro Vancouver, and killing 60% of the mature spruce tree in that area. Over 5 million cubic meters of timber was harvested. Currently, the Omanika region in the central interior of the province, most or a lot of it in my riding, has seen nearly 1 million hectares, that's 4 times the size of Metro Vancouver, of mature spruce killed by the spruce beetle since 2015. Over 4 million hectares of BC forests have been consumed by wildfires since the 1990s, many of these fires destroying young plantations. The densities of forest plantations have contributed to the intensity of these fires in many respects. In examining other jurisdictions outside of Canada experiencing increased incidents of wildfires, many identified the increased forest densities as a major contributing factor. San Bernardino County is one such area, taking aggressive steps to thin forests that have increased over time because of forestry practices and lack of controlled burning. They're also reestablishing indigenous deciduous growth, broadleaf trees that may have no commercial value as saw logs, but invaluable in the mitigation in the spread of wildfire. With the coming into force of FERPA in 2004, forest companies were required to submit forest stewardship plans that addressed specific objectives set by government. These objectives, contained in the regulations, were to address soils, visual quality, timber, forage, water, fish, wildlife, biodiversity, resource features, and cultural heritage resources. The problem, however, were that the regulations also provided an off-ramp, whereby the objectives were subordinated by the clause without unduly reducing the supply of timber from British Columbia's forests. Government made the decision in the 1990s that only 1% retention of wildlife habitat and 2.3% of old-growth forest was necessary for maintenance and preservation of biodiversity. 1%. This determination was also recognized in 2013 by the BC Auditor General. In his report attached to that audit, he states that under the Forest and Range Practices Act, the minister can list endangered, threatened, or vulnerable vertebrate or invertebrate species and endangered or threatened plants and plant communities that might be negatively affected by forest or range management on Crown land. To date, 85 species and plant communities have been identified. Government's objective for these species is to conserve sufficient wildlife habitat, but without unduly reducing the supply of timber from British Columbia's forests. So, for an example, Government limits the amount of area that can be designated as wildlife habitat to 1% impact on the provincial land base for forest and range activities. We found no scientific rationale for this policy. A year-end status report for 2018 published by the Forest Products Association of British Columbia claims that forest companies in British Columbia have over 50 million hectares of forest certified as sustainably managed. BC has 54 million hectares total of forest cover right across the province. This is an interesting number considering that BC has only 22 million hectares in the timber harvest land base. This certification is administered by 3 certification bodies: the Canadian Standards Association, the Forest Stewardship Council, and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. These reports indicate that SFI alone has certified nearly 30 million hectares. A common thread amongst all 3 programs is to ensure forest companies are in compliance with all applicable federal, provincial, regional, or municipal laws. One very significant area of law that appears to have been purposefully overlooked or avoided is the disturbance of nests or eggs. Under Canada's Migratory Bird Convention Act and the applicable regulations, it's an offence to disturb or destroy a nest or eggs, which specifically in British Columbia is the period between May and August. There's also similar provisions under the BC Wildlife Act. These sections are strictly enforced in the development of mining, oil and gas, hydro, pipeline, and associated right-of-way and other construction projects in and around the province, but are entirely overlooked in all aspects of forest harvesting. A paper published in 2013 entitled "An Estimate of Nests Lost in Canada Due to Industrial Forestry Operations" examined the impact on birds from industrial forest harvesting across Canada. The researchers found that data available in British Columbia was extensive and examined BC separately from the rest of Canada. Using the BC Harvest Billing System, they were able to extrapolate the volume harvested during the bird breeding season, and conclusions based on their model determined that over 400,000 nests are lost to logging in BC on an annual basis, preventing hundreds of thousands of birds from entering the adult population each year. During the time birds are nesting and breeding, mammals from mice to moose are also giving birth and raising their young. Nesting and denning sites are lined with grasses, leaves, and other plant matter. There are over 65 species of wildlife in BC that use tree cavities for denning and nesting purposes. Considering that most tree cavities don't start developing until a tree is 75 to 100 years old, rotations under this age will eliminate those species from British Columbia forests forever. Forest silviculture practices began spraying glyphosate herbicide in the early 1980s and have sprayed hundreds of thousands of hectares across the province, with nearly a third of that applied in the Prince George timber supply area, eliminating the grasses, leaves, berries, and seeds so many mammals depend on for survival. Recent research near Prince George indicates that the moose are starving to death because of the lack of protein in their food supply. Reduced plant protein in the plant species preferred for browsing is believed to be caused by overexposure to sunlight stemming from large clear-cuts. This recent research follows a recent moose collaring project to determine the cause of moose mortality in 3 locations in the interior where starvation was found to be a major factor. Ungulate populations, moose, mule deer, caribou, etc., fur bearers, birds, and fish populations, steelhead and salmon, have decreased significantly across the province over the past 20 years. As noted above, ungulate starvation is a major contributing factor, as are predators, but the overarching factor behind all species decline is the loss of habitat. According to the Chief Forester, many factors are considered in determining provincial timber harvest levels. Economic considerations and other values on the land supposedly play a significant role. However, the valuation of the other values on the land have never been undertaken. There was an interesting case where the province was attempting to claim damages to biodiversity from a forest fire, which went to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2004. The province, in its factum to the court, presented some areas for consideration for evaluating biodiversity. They included the nature of the wildlife, plants, and other organisms protected by the environment in question, the uniqueness of the ecosystem from a biological perspective, the environmental services provided by the resource, such as water quality and erosion control, the recreational opportunities afforded by the resource, and the subjective or emotional attachment of the public to the damaged or destroyed areas. Since this court decision, there has been no progress on evaluating these considerations, which quite frankly represent but a fraction of the true value of biodiversity. If one were to consider the protein value of all the ungulates, the fish and fowl on the land, and the fact that this protein is renewable every year, the extrinsic value of fruits, mushrooms, and other edible plants on the landscape, again, with new production on an annual basis, as well as the intrinsic considerations presented to the court, a different vision of our landscape would surely emerge. I return to the Pierce report from the 1975 Royal Commission on Forest Resources, where Commissioner Pierce stated, "The old-growth timber on which our industry has been built was often of exceptionally high quality, capable of manufacturing the products that command premium prices in world markets. As this stock is depleted, and it's appropriate to refer to it as stock since it is not reproducible within any meaningful planning horizon, much of the special advantage this province's timber has enjoyed will be lost." Perhaps we reached that point several decades ago, where we lost our competitive advantage because we depleted our stock of high-quality, old-growth timber. Did the Royal Commission in 1945 envision the sustainable yield policy as transforming 22 million hectares of forest into managed forests, or referred to as working forest by industry, focused on yield and growth only, with no considerations for the other values on the land? Did they envision an automated forest industry employing a fraction of the population that it once did? British Columbia is different than other jurisdictions, geographically, bioclimatically, ecologically, and demographically. Another major difference that separates us from most jurisdictions around the world, BC has retained Crown ownership of 92% of the land base. Had Justice Sloan determined in 1945 that the perpetuation of forest cover to assure the continuance of the many direct and indirect benefits which flow therefrom, in addition to the mere growing of wood, was an essential ingredient in the definition of sustained yield, would we be facing the dire consequences that we're facing today? Is wall-to-wall manicured tree farms what the Sloan Commission had in mind in 1945, or what the successive governments envisioned when implementing and supporting the sustained yield policy? If they did, it's now clear that this policy no longer fits the biodiversity, watershed, wildlife, fire protection, and climate change priorities for the 21st century. Such a policy certainly doesn't match the marketing brand of supernatural British Columbia. This policy has placed British Columbia in a precarious position where we have limited time left to act to maintain what we have left of some of the most unique biodiversity in North America. A bold new strategy recognizing the value of an entire forest, not just the trees, is required to sustain our province into the future. Mr. Speaker, Bill 23 doesn't even come close to addressing these issues. Thank you.